Okay, one more time here. Finishing up this is just a lot of material in it. So we're going to look at chapter 14. Won't take me just a few minutes to go through this. And you see it, the title is on page 516, and that's the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes they call it, if you come down in that first paragraph, you see it at the end of that first paragraph on page 518, it says the visceral motor division. So it's dealing with the organs, not with our skeletal muscles that we have voluntary control over. So as you read on in the next paragraph, you see it in the second line, homeostasis is mostly maintained by the hypothalamus. Saying the same thing again, it also adds the reticular formation, which we didn't cover, so don't worry about that. We'll just simply deal with the hypothalamus at this point. And you see there are two divisions or two branches of the autonomic nervous system, and that's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So looking over on 517, functions of the ANS, autonomic nervous system, and visceral reflex arcs. Remember when we talked about a reflex arc? You had to have an afferent neuron. That's one set of receptors going to pick up a stimulus. Got to take it to the central nervous system. That's number two. And then out of the central nervous system comes the efferent neuron or the motor neuron. So you got to have three components in a reflex arc. And you have a similar thing in the autonomic nervous system. If you look at the top of page 517 and look at figure 14.1, there's a visceral reflex arc. And there at that point, looking at the stomach. So you look at the blue, that's an afferent neuron. So if something is going wrong with your stomach for whatever reason, maybe you got an ulcer in there or something like that, or you ate some food that's not really good or whatever, and maybe you're getting nauseated, and so now you're going to kick this stuff out, and it's not like you're doing it, your system's doing it. So you see the blue, there's where the afferent neuron is, and there's where the message goes in to the central nervous system. So the afferent neuron is that one's got the receptor on it. And then it takes it to the central nervous system. It comes back out of the central nervous system, and here's something that's different. You see it has the motor neuron, the efferent neuron goes through a ganglion, an autonomic ganglion, which is very close most of the time to the nervous system, but it can also be close to the organ that you want to innervate. So anyway, it's got to go through an autonomic ganglion, and then you see the rest of it goes to the stomach. Now, when you look at that red circuit where it points at efferent neuron, that would be a pre-ganglionic neuron. Here's your ganglion. Pre would be before. And then when it comes out, it's a post-ganglionic neuron. Okay? And then it goes to an organ or a gland or something like that. So those are the components of a visceral reflex arc. Afferent neuron, central nervous system. Efferent, you have two efferent neurons. We're going to mention that in a minute. And you got a little ganglion in between there. Why? Sometimes we don't know why, but all we can do is just record what we see. We don't have a handle on everything. Don't ever think science has got it figured out. Okay, so now you come down to the bottom of the page. On page 517, you're looking at figure 14.2. And here is a comparison, or I should say a contrast, of a somatic nervous system neuron or circuit and an autonomic nervous system. Now, they list three differences, but there is a fourth one. If you look at it, see how it's different. You'll see that, and you'll go, okay, there's four differences there, isn't there? Yeah. Okay, so you want to know that difference between a somatic neuron and a visceral autonomic neuron. Actually, well, I'll just tell you one of them. You see, when you have a message coming down a somatic motor neuron, there's only one neuron. But in the autonomic nervous system, there are two neurons. Okay, and you figure out the other two things that are different about the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Don't do that to me, Mr. Pritchett. Please don't do that to me. Got to make you think, got to stretch you a little bit. Now, as you look on page 518, there is a difference between sympathetic neurons, autonomic neurons, and parasympathetic autonomic neurons, or autonomic parasympathetic. You got those two systems, and you already know that the sympathetic is fight or flight type responses, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. But look at the difference, and I don't know why they're like this. I got no idea. Again, all we can do is just say, well, that's what we see. You see, the sympathetic can also be called the thoracolumbar system because the nerves come out of the thorax in the lumbar region. The parasympathetic can be called the craniosacral. As you come down in the page, you see the brain there, the half brain. You see the green up top and the green at the bottom. Craniosacral, that's where those come off. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? We don't understand all of that. All we can do is sometimes learn to work with it, and we have learned to slow some things down sometimes. But notice the thoracolumbar spinal cord. This is where the preganglionic neuron is. Now, it's in the spinal cord, in the thorax or the lumbar region. And notice the preganglionic neuron has a very short axon. The postganglionic neuron has a very long axon, which hooks to the target cell. The opposite is true of the parasympathetic. Why? Got me. Brainstem and sacral spinal cord. There's your parasympathetic, so they call it the craniosacral. Now, in this case, the preganglionic neuron still in the spinal cord, but it has a long axon. And here, the ganglion, instead of being right outside where synapsing occurs, it's real close to the target cell. So in the sympathetic, the postganglionic neuron has a long axon that goes right to the effector, target cell. But then in the postganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic, it's got a real short axon that goes to the target cell. Don't know why. But those are your two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, that make up the autonomic nervous system. And sometimes people call them the craniosacral and the thoracolumbar. So they got a couple of names there. And these two systems, if you will come over to page 519, you look in that first column and you see, come on down about halfway down, you see it says the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Balance, homeostasis. You cannot get away from that. There are so many homeostatic mechanisms that keep us, can we say, in the middle of the road in terms of physiology. Don't want to go off the road. Either way, you're going to have a problem. So, these two systems are antagonistic to each other. One is going to slow things down, one is going to speed things up. There is a balance. Okay? Now, what we want to do is scoot over to page 521, and you look on page 521, the second column, and you see this heading that says sympathetic neurotransmitters and receptors. Come down to the bottom there where you see classes of sympathetic neurotransmitters. And they're going to list some. They're going to list acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. You already know about that because that was involved with myoneural junctions, wasn't it? When you get to 522, then you get to the second paragraph in the first column, and you see the bold print terms norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. Now, what we want to do is come down to the next section, which says classes of sympathetic receptors, which would accept acetylcholine, which would accept norepinephrine or epinephrine. So you come down and you see adrenergic receptors. That means they're going to receive norepinephrine and epinephrine. I believe I included acetylcholine. I shouldn't do that. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to work on adrenergic receptors. Acetylcholine works on cholinergic receptors. Those receptors, remember, are proteins. So you got different proteins that will receive norepinephrine or epinephrine, but they wouldn't receive acetylcholine. But then you got a cholinergic receptor. That's different from the adrenergic receptor, different protein. Has a different number of amino acids, arrangement, sequence of the amino acids. Okay. Now, you come down to under classes of sympathetic receptors, and we're not going to do everything in here, but I want you to know there are alpha 1 receptors and there are alpha receptors generally. And then look over in the second column and you see beta receptors. Now, we're not going to get into all the details about this, but if you look at your Word document, you come down on page 2 of that Word document. Classes of sympathetic receptors is in about the middle of the paper. Adrenergic receptors, norepinephrine and epinephrine are the neurotransmitters. And don't worry about the two types of alpha and beta. Well, yeah, you want to know alpha and beta. Don't get into alpha 1 and beta 2 and all that stuff. Alpha and beta adrenergic receptors are different proteins. Notice that the alpha receptors are on visceral muscle cells. Visceral like your bladder. Visceral like your GI tract. Beta receptors are located on cardiac muscles and bronchioles, muscles in the bronchioles. Okay? Notice the last sentence that I wrote down there on the Word document. There are drugs called alpha and beta blockers. If we block a receptor, then you can pour norepinephrine or epinephrine on it all day long and nothing's going to happen. The intended result of having norepinephrine attached to a receptor is to, for instance, increase the heart rate. But if you put a beta blocker on it in your body, that blocks the norepinephrine from attaching to the receptor, and the heart rate doesn't go up. It doesn't contract as hard. So it relaxes your heart more, which would drop blood pressure. Look down at the bottom of page 2 on your handout. You see it says effects on cardiac and visceral muscle. Alpha blockers can prevent vasoconstriction and therefore reduce blood pressure. So norepinephrine, if they combine with an alpha blocker, or if they combine with an adrenergic receptor, they would cause vasoconstriction. Blood pressure goes up. If you got blood pressure problems, you take a alpha blocker. It prevents norepinephrine or epinephrine from attaching to the adrenergic receptor, and the blood vessels do not constrict. Therefore, the blood pressure is lowered. Fascinating. And you make a living at it. And then you can see what happens with beta blockers and the heart rate and the force of contraction. And then you have the cholinergic receptors, and that's where acetylcholine binds to. And you don't need to know about nicotinic or muscarinic, right? Now, still on page 3 of the handout, or you can look on, let's see, page 523 if you want to. Effects on cardiac muscle cells. When norepinephrine, you come down to that section where norepinephrine binds, it mediates the following changes. Mediates means to bring about. Constriction of blood vessels serving the digestive and urinary and integumentary systems. So it cuts the flow to your gut, to your bladder, to your skin. So you get more to your heart and your skeletal muscles get more blood. That's what happens in a fight or flight response. At the same time, you come down to see dilation of bronchioles. What happens is those muscles open up the bronchioles, so you get more air into your lungs. Remember, this is a fight or flight situation. Come over on the next page, next column, and you see it says dilation of blood vessels serving skeletal and cardiac muscle. Although norepinephrine constricts most of the body's blood vessels when it binds to, we'll just call it a beta receptor on visceral muscle. It causes them to relax. This opens the blood vessels in an action called vasodilation and increases the blood flow and the delivery of oxygen to those cells. Smooth muscle cells are blood vessels serving skeletal and cardiac muscle. It causes them to relax, so they get more oxygen, more glucose, more blood. Okay? And let's scoot over to page 528. And you're looking in the first column. And you come down to the effects of parasympathetic nervous system on target cells, effects on cardiac muscle cells, sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate and blood pressure. So it follows that the parasympathetic nervous system would do the opposite, because that's the rest and digest. So you come down to where you see effects on smooth muscle cells. It causes instead of the muscles of the bronchi to dilate, it causes constriction, which means you don't use as much oxygen. You don't need as much oxygen. Up at the top of the next column, contraction of the smooth muscle lining the digestive tract. Parasympathetic neurons of the vagus nerve also trigger contraction of the smooth muscle cells lining the GI tract. This produces rhythmic contractions known as peristalsis. So when you're resting, you're going to get this acetylcholine released in the parasympathetic nervous system, and your GI tract's going to go back to working on a meal, and you tend to rest and relax while that is occurring. Okay? I think that is it. Okay, so you know where to read. All right. If you have any questions, you can certainly, let me see something here for just a second. Okay. All right. So if you have questions, you know what you can do. You can shoot me an email or give me a call at the phone that's on the syllabus. Okay. I'll see you come for the test on Thursday. All right. See you later.